This presentation will look to critique and review some of the teaching practices from our Aussie Rules Micro Session and provide some recommendations for practice that situate within the broader context of PE. The broad aim of the session was to introduce the participants to the game of Aussie Rules and provide them with a learning environment whereby they could develop an initial understanding of positional awareness and the basic dynamics of the game. This links in with the aims of the national curriculum for PE that students should begin to develop tactics and strategies to overcome their opponents in team games. Before critiquing the teaching practices within the session, it is first relevant to theoretically frame the session in terms of the learning environment that was created. To draw on the work of Renshaw et al. 2009, an ecological dynamical pedagogical approach was adopted, which involves creating an environment that is fluid and unpredictable, yet still is representative of game scenarios. By adding in these unpredictable constraints and factors, you begin to challenge the participants to become adaptive, facilitating them into making conscious decisions about how to deal with and perform under changing constraints. The ecological dynamic systems approach to pedagogy and teaching views the learner as a human movement system residing within an ever-changing nonlinear environment. In the view of Davids, Bennett and Newell 2006, the learner and the learning environment essentially become interconnected, and emerging from this interaction would be development on the learner's behalf to self-organize and act upon external flows of information, where they will be able to transition their movement competencies to a variety of different scenarios. To contextualize and synthesize this alongside the Aussie Rules session, an initial environment was created using the half pitch, and then as the session progressed, we introduced new dynamic elements such as the zones and other constraints, to which the participants had to interact with to develop their movement skills. In terms of practice, to achieve the desired outcomes of our session, we essentially manipulated the environment using a constraints-based approach. Adopting a constraints-based approach within a dynamical systems environment has implications in terms of practice. It requires the practitioner to design and implement task and environmental-based constraints, considering the scenario and game-based context in which the participants are operating in. The initial constraint was that both teams were working in the half pitch with one set of posts. The ball was turned over, then the team who won back possession would return to the halfway line to restart a new phase of play. Then we introduced the zones as the key environmental constraint, forcing the participants to adapt their movement patterns and interact with this new affordance. Through this interaction with the environmental and task-based constraints set up by the session, for the participants, perception and action start to become interconnected, where movement tendencies are established. Zoning the players into positioning facilitated them into actively engaging with the new environment created by the constraint, forcing them to make decisions based upon what is in front of them. By the end of the session, when we took away the zones, they were actively getting into good positions and improved their positioning. It is relevant to take a brief look at where the session fits into the widely referred to framework of teaching styles from Moston and Ashworth. The session aligns most with the idea of a divergent production style, which seeks to facilitate the learners into discovering multiple responses to a single scenario or situation given by the practitioner. From an engagement in this teaching style on the learner's behalf, a development in divergent thinking will occur, where multiple ways of completing a task or being competent in a given scenario are achieved. Through this, the learner becomes more able to adapt their movement patterns so that a range of responses can be carried out to still achieve the same goal. This style of teaching was effective for the lesson because, as outlined, the participants took an active role in the lesson, learning for themselves and developing their own movement patterns through the facilitated environment. However, looking at teaching Aussie Rules in the broader context of PE, there are various scenarios where a different teaching style would be more suitable. For example, if you wanted to introduce tackling to a Key Stage 4 group who had only been introduced to the game in that term, it would be more effective to use a command or practice style where the role of the learner is to follow the produced response of the teacher and then embed this as practice. Tackling is a dangerous element of the game, and where elements of safety concern with a young group of students, it is required to give some detailed instruction of how to tackle properly in a command style so that no one is injured. Following on from theorising the session and situating it within the broader literature, critiques of the session will now be reviewed alongside some recommendations for future practice. Although the constraints-based approach was effective and did facilitate evident improvement in player positioning, it could have been better utilised in terms of practice. When thinking about teaching practice for a constraints-based approach, it is imperative that the practitioner refers to and designs the session around the core game principles, making use of game representative tasks that can help the players develop movement sets across a variety of different contexts. By making the participants play half pitch with only one set of goals, we were actually moving away slightly from the principles of Aussie Rules, which involves playing on the full pitch with two posts. This pertains to one of the disadvantages of using a constraints-based approach. Although it can be effective for developing an adaptable set of movement patterns and ability to interact with your environment, it can also become too artificial in the attempts to create new stimuli and factor up ending taking the participants away from the core principles of the game you are actually trying to play. Taking these views into account, it would have been better to start with a half-pitch game, then move into the full-pitch game, so that variability would have been achieved and a coherence with the principles of Aussie Rules. In addition to this, in terms of linking the session with the game principles, we carried out the introduction away from the pitch itself, almost detaching that explanation from the environment in which we were about to play. Introducing the lesson whilst physically positioning the group in the area in which the lesson will take place would have helped to increase the understanding even further. Another perspective for future teaching practice in employing a constraints-led approach can be seen in the work of Pill 2014. He suggests a more effective way to implement a constraints-led approach within a dynamical system for the game of Australian football. He mentions how a coach must be able to appreciate that tactical behaviours that are embedded within the constrained structures of subsystems where players act in attacker-defender relationships. So essentially, for effective constraints-led coaching to take place, effective subsystem behaviours must first become established before they are situated in the larger game system. In terms of the context of PE, the idea of considering subsystems can also refer to knowing your students and how their individual behaviours situate within the lesson. Not knowing if there is an individual that works ineffectively with other pupils and then putting them together can lead to a disruption to the whole lesson environment. Pill 2014 highlights how 3v3 play practice can be very effective at developing these subsystem behaviours. For example, in the model below, the player in possession must decide within this specific attacking scenario to pass before or after they go past the first defensive line. The constraints-based approach that was adopted for our session focused only on the larger game system. Relating to Pill's recommendations and work, it is easy to forget sometimes that the individual phases taking place in sports such as Australian football and rugby only include a handful of players from each side, no more than 2 or 3 at one time. Thinking about it as a first PE lesson of the term, it may have been more effective to set up some 3-on-3 player practices so that those movement patterns could be established within the subsystems before transitioning that practice to a full game. The utilisation of differentiation within teaching practices for PE is essential and is something that could have been considered more in our teaching session. There were those who were able to just run with the ball, essentially bypassing all of the opposition players and score through the post, finding the game too easy. Differentiation is achieved where the practitioner accommodates for their students' varied needs and level of ability. In terms of practice, rather than assigning the same task for the whole class, 2 differing yet simultaneous activities are carried out that suit the varying levels of ability. Effective employment of differentiation in the lesson focuses more on the learning processes that occur as opposed to the product that comes about of the tasks that the students complete. Essentially, differentiation seeks to maximise the learning capacity of each student, making PE more of an inclusive setting that considers the different levels of development within the class. As the literature notes, the simultaneous nature of the task is an important factor for the practice of differentiation. When you are teaching in PE, it is crucial to keep all of the participants active at all times, no matter what their ability is. The simultaneous nature achieves both a fluid and active lesson where all students, no matter what their ability they are, can play alongside each other in one game. This could have been achieved in our session. For those who found the game too easy, task-based differentiation could have been employed where they are only allowed to move 10 paces before offloading the ball. Then, participants who are less confident and lack competency in moving with the ball can run any amount of distance before they either pass or score, evening up the game. Through this, a fluid game is carried out that achieves differentiation. In conclusion, and to summarise, setting up the session as an ecological environment that adopted a constraints-based approach did to some extent provide a successful framework for learning to take place. Participants found the session fun, and there was evident improvement at the end, which is extremely important for the context of PE. However, moving forward, there are several ways in which I can improve and adapt my teaching practices. These include making sure that the session is tailored to the game-based principles of the sport, and the constraints-based approach does not become too complex for the participants. In addition, differentiation has been considered as a teaching practice. Alongside that, will make the session more inclusive and active for all students involved.